Probably no one has ever told you that you have this need. And when a need goes unfulfilled, it's very painful, it's very uncomfortable, it's very unfulfilling. And when you get your needs met, when you get them fulfilled, it feels fulfilling. It feels like wholeness. It feels good. So this video is going to be explaining the need to simply exist, or the need for non-doing. I'm going to be using these interchangeably in this video. So the need to simply exist is an intrinsic yearning to return to a pure state of being. A state of being that is unburdened by the constant demands of solving, accomplishing, achieving, striving, and just doing as a whole. And this leads to the deep recognition that life, in its essence and totally as it already is complete and perfect. And there has to be nothing done to it whatsoever. No justification, no alteration, no explanation of any kind. And this immediately, as a lot of you can probably tell, goes very against the conditioning of Western society. It goes very deeply against a lot of the things that we've been conditioned with, which is why it can be such a paradox in our mind. It's so confusing. And I'll be explaining that later on in the video. For now, I want to give you a lot of examples of what this need really means so that you can begin to form a good picture of it in your mind. So this involves to not need to strive, to not need to accomplish a goal, to not need to figure anything out, to not need to solve a problem, to not need to get more, to not need to remove anything, to not need to avoid what is happening right now, to not need to resist what is happening right now, to not need to change anything about yourself, to not need to change anything about anyone else, to not need to know what happens next, to not need to compare yourself to others, to not need to prove your worth, to not need to make sense of pain, to not need to control the outcome, to not need to control your emotions or to resist your emotions, to not need to justify your existence, to not need to seek external approval, to not need to label or categorize your experience, to not need to run from silence, to not need to align with anyone else's expectations, to not need to find a purpose, to not need to rush to the next moment, to not need to feel a certain way, to not need to define your experiences, to not need to understand why things happen, to not need to escape discomfort, to not need to hold on to a particular identity, to not need to be productive, to not need to defend yourself, to not need to correct others, to not need to chase happiness, to not need to suppress your thoughts, to not need to align with societal norms, to not need to anticipate the future, to not need to seek closure, to not need to explain your feelings, to not need to overcome every obstacle, to not need to feel important or special, to not need to validate your choices, to not need to remove imperfection, to not need to entertain anyone, to not need to accomplish anything, to not need to filter or refine your expression, to not need to move beyond the present moment, to not need to cling to any particular outcome, to not need to know anything, and to not need to attempt to trap life itself in our human mental constructs. Now, this is a need that arises out of a deeper desire for wholeness. Essentially, it's this sort of pull to reconnect with the actual raw existence of ourselves, aside from conditioning, the pure unconditioned nature of reality. It's this innate and just intrinsic yearning to reconnect with something beyond our own conditioning. This aligns with self-transcendence needs. Essentially, it's freedom from conditioning, harmony with the present, and a deeper sense of authentic living. It leads to the recognition that simply existing is the purest form of life. And I really want to tell you that this is actually quite counterintuitively, it's advanced. It's so simple, yet so complicated. There's no real way to trap this need into a box and have it make the most perfect sense to you, because essentially this need, like I said, because it goes for self-transcendence, this need doesn't fit into a category as our minds want it to be. Our minds like to think very categorically: self versus not self, tree versus a fork, pig versus human, animals, man versus nature, science versus religion, left versus right, up versus down. Our minds split reality into all these categories that don't really exist. They're not actually existing there. They're projections of our own mind. And this need allows us to move beyond that into a state of non-dual awareness, or at least the realization of the non-dual awareness that's just ever present. So I want to actually emphasize a little bit of these weird nuances to this, because there's probably a lot of objections, like, if I do this, am I going to be lazy and stupid? You said I don't have to know anything. Or am I just going to be a fool? Am I going to be lazy? Is this an excuse to avoid my responsibilities? Things like this. So this is not about inactivity. It's not about avoidance, but it's about experiencing life exactly as it is and without any filters. Just allowing space for presence, connection, and acceptance of all that is. Essentially, it's about reconnecting to the pure essence of creation and just realizing very directly for yourself what that even is. It's about deconstructing our mind's conditioning. And instead of acting out of conditioning, things that were very artificial and very unnatural to us, we act out of what is natural to us. It's a return to a natural way of being. And the realization of something beyond conditioning, the realization of who and what you are beyond your conditioning, beyond your ego. So this is a higher need that most of mankind is unfamiliar with. This is tied to the need to transcend the separate self and to realize who and what you are, beyond the illusion of being a human, beyond the illusion of being an ego, beyond the illusion of being a separate self. This is about the need to realize the truth of reality, and that's really the essence of it. Realizing the truth of what reality is for yourself without needing to believe a Bible, a Quran, or the Upanishads, without needing to believe a scientist in a lab coat or the new peer-reviewed study, without needing to listen to any kind of human construct whatsoever, but to actually go to the very source of creation and to recognize very directly what it is, and that it's you. In Christianity, they talk about God. There's a beautiful Jesus Christ quote, "The Father and I are one." In Buddhism and Hinduism, they talk very directly about non-duality. The word Islam literally means to submit or to surrender to God's will, to surrender to the will of this right here. Surrendering to right here, right now. Surrendering all the need to do. And counterintuitively, this deconstructs a lot of the conditioning that actually filters your perception. Because a lot of our conditioning is very habitual. It keeps us locked in this sort of same state and level of consciousness. And to just kind of detach, this begins to deconstruct all the things that we're using to create this illusion of self and all these kinds of illusions of security. Again, this is about getting what's true for yourself, not even needing to believe me. You don't have to believe me. I don't care whether or not you believe me. That's not the point of this. This is something that you can actually do. The rough part is that because we're so conditioned to fight this need inside of us, right? Just kind of look at our culture, hyper productivity, the need to make things hard. If someone does something that's easy, we don't care. You took the easy way out. We use struggle as a way to gain acceptance from others, right? So the rough part is that we're so conditioned to always be fighting this need We can't surrender the struggle. Right? We can't surrender the fight against the present experience. We're always fighting it. Right? We fight against this aspect of ourselves, which is fundamentally uncomfortable. And we're doing this without even knowing that we're doing so. We avoid the pain of the lack of fulfillment of this need by habitually, mechanically, and addictively doing. It's an addiction. It's compulsive. It's deeply unconscious. It's automatic. It's something we take for granted. Fulfilling this need involves addressing this pain head on rather than always fighting against it. And we're so conditioned to always just want to avoid it. Because the second we start addressing this head on, a lot of our favorite beliefs all start to kind of crumble away. A lot of our favorite forms of conditioning begin to reveal themselves to just be this illusion, not as solid as we thought it was. Our sense of who we are becomes more fluid and expanded rather than contracted and solid and fixed and rigid. The very sense and feeling of what it's like to be you changes. The perception of reality changes. You see life in an unfiltered way, without all the delusions of the separate self, of the ego mind. So let's talk about the paradox of this need. I said I would get to this. So the need to simply exist is paradoxical, not only because it contradicts the sort of structure and demands of our conventional daily life, but because, like I said, it goes against what we've been conditioned with. So we can't help it. We're trying to interpret this from the lens of our conditioning. We're trying to interpret something we don't know or might not understand from the lens of what we do understand. When in actuality, we have to raise our consciousness to a new level and move beyond our current limitations to realize something new. And doing that doesn't always mean adding more, but doing that might mean the removal of certain things, the removal of conditioning, the opening up rather than the closing down. Because a lot of the things we know, a lot of our conditioning, it closes us down. It actually shuts our mind off from creative insight, from spontaneity, from the actual beauty and perfection of reality itself. So in essence, to actually fulfill this need, you have to learn to let go a lot of your preconceived notions, preconceived beliefs, right? And then look at life totally openly and fresh again, as if you were a newborn baby. If you've ever seen a newborn baby, they're just right there looking at existence, eyes wide open, right? They're like, wow. So it's essentially we're stripping away all the things we've been conditioned with to just perceive life as it is. And a lot of the things that we were conditioned with, basically we held on to this stuff in order to avoid pain. So a lot of our worldview actually comes from the avoidance of pain. Our beliefs act as ways to mitigate anxiety and to just kind of allow ourselves to feel like we know, allow ourselves to feel certain about our existence. And then when we question these things, there's a lot of emotions that come up, a lot of repressed energy that comes up, anxiety, discomfort, confusion. Right? So when we're deconstructing a lot of our conditioning, it's likely that we're going to run into things like that because there's these aspects of ourselves that, and these mechanisms inside of ourselves that we're just there to repress, to hold something down. And that inner struggle, that inner repression is uncomfortable. This is us fighting this need unconsciously without even recognizing that we're doing so, because we don't typically identify this need in any major world culture, although it's a completely valid need. So despite the apparent contradiction, right, of non-doing versus doing, both coexist and they enhance life rather than conflicting with one another. Each enhances each other. I want to kind of point out the yin-yang from Chinese philosophy, right, where there's the black and then the white, and in the black there's a dot of the white, and in the white there's a dot of the black, and then there's that circle encompassing both, right? And it's kind of the merging of this duality, where instead of things actually contradicting one another and things fighting against one another, they paradoxically, counterintuitively work with each other. So I want to kind of just list off a lot of these strange paradoxes so that you understand exactly what I'm talking about. So the need to simply exist versus the drive to do, or the drive for constant achievement. This being, of course, one that I've said in a few times now in this video. This also involves freedom from attachment versus attachment to roles and identities. Again, we can't hold these things as separate. Don't be too dualistic here. Right? Do not think of these things as like separate categories that exist, because this is an illusion that the mind constructs. In fact, there's no boundary separating these things. So they actually work together rather than it just being one or the other. The pursuit of inner peace versus, let's say, external distractions. Needing to work, needing to do something, needing to maintain yourself as a human being. Acceptance of imperfection versus striving for perfection. Being in the present moment versus planning for the future. This is a really good one. Detachment from outcomes versus pursuing goals. I think this is a very relatable one, where when you're kind of doing something, you're able to kind of let go of the end result, and in fact, it makes it 1,000 times better. It makes you more creative, right? When you're always fixated on that end result, you're A, not enjoying the process, and B, limiting the work that you're doing to that preconceived notion. When you let go of that notion, it can be 1,000 times better. It might be something that you didn't even think could be possible. Letting go of problems versus solving them. How many times have you tried to solve a problem and you're overthinking, and you just stop? Are you burning yourself out? You decide to instead just go look outside, do anything else. Just let go of the need to solve the problem, and then bam, the solution hits you. Non-doing versus the need to stay busy and do, right? I really like that, the emphasis that I wrote in that one on staying busy. Right? I think that's probably one of the perfect ways to describe Western culture, the need to stay busy. I believe when Thich Nhat Hanh was asked how he, if he could summarize Western culture in one sentence, his response was lost in thought. So embracing silence versus constant stimulation, right? You have a need for silence, but then you also have a need for stimulation to enjoy, let's say, a movie, or to relax with a loved one and play a game every once in a while, or to read a book or do something creative, right? There's all forms of stimulation, right? And then the need to not be stimulated all the time because it's overstimulating, and then that's sickening, right? But then you can't always live in silence because life naturally pushes you out to socialize or go to an event, right? It's just all this stuff is working synergistically rather than opposing each other. Let go of this opposition to one another. This is why it becomes confusing. Surrendering to what is versus controlling circumstances. That's a very interesting one. I urge you to play with that one a lot. Letting go of resistance versus fighting against discomfort. That one's another very strange one. I urge you to kind of just play around with that one as well. The flow of being versus structure and routine. Right? The structure of your daily life, the habits, the routine, go to work, make dinner, etc., versus the flow of being. We might think that these are two completely different things, right? Because at those far ends of the spectrum, they are. But then as we begin to kind of integrate them both into our life, right, and we get closer to the middle, right, we recognize that, the lines between them actually blur, and that the structure of my life actually adds to the flow of being. And if I have the correct structure, right, the structure that works with me and is in alignment with me, this actually puts me more into flow. And sometimes I'm urged to completely let go of structure into just pure flow. And then sometimes it's the exact opposite way, where life urges you to have a lot more structure because it's contextual. Life is dynamic and ever-changing and impermanent. Everything is in this constant state of change and movement. Every atom is vibrating. The second you label something a word, the second you label it hand, the cells have moved, the blood has flown, the atoms have vibrated. The second you label it hand, the whole thing has changed. So the only way to really know what this really is to be present with it right here in the moment, and to let go of the mind, to grasp what this is beyond concept. The way to do that is by being fully present with it and by practicing that. Right? Very confusing, especially if you're just kind of lost in thought all the time. You haven't practiced any mindfulness. Right? It's going to be very weird. This idea is not going to fit into your mind very neatly. But I want you to kind of intuit that there's something of deep value here that I'm trying to communicate to you and I'm trying to give to you. And if you want more of an explanation, you can check out my book list, go to the psychology section, pick up a lot of books by Abraham Maslow. These are pretty good books. The Toward a Psychology of Being, The Further Reaches of Human Nature. These are very good books. Check out the Consciousness and Spirituality section. I recommend books by Adyashanti, maybe Emptiness Dancing. These are good books for kind of just building a bit more of an understanding of these so that your mind feels a bit more comfortable with these ideas. The absence of need versus the urgency of productivity. The absence of needing to do anything versus the urgency of needing to do something. Sometimes something's urgent, right? Someone needs to be put into an ambulance. I call 911. It's urgent. You can't slack, right? But then when we get stuck in that, which a lot of us are, we're always rushing to the next moment. There's always a rush. There's never enough time. There's a scarcity of time, right? We don't really know the sort of absence of urgency. We don't really know the peace that comes with just letting it go. If you want a good example of that, look at indigenous elders with a lot of wisdom, Zen masters. They seem to understand that quite well. Peace in the unknown versus the need for certainty. Sometimes true certainty lies in the unknown and not needing to figure it out. By letting go of the mind, you discover something far greater than just human constructs and ideas. You realize something beyond ordinary certainty, something that you're so certain of. Again, very paradoxical. By letting go of certainty and moving into the unknown, you realize the only thing that there is to be certain of, which is the very nature of reality. Stillness versus movement, and embracing the present versus focusing on the past. Okay, so a lot of these paradoxes show that far from being at odds, the need to simply exist and our conventional life patterns actually complement each other. So the key is not in rejecting structure, goals, productivity, the world, doing. Right? If you reject that, you're making a massive error. This is a huge error. This is completely not the point. This doesn't mean you can't solve a problem. This doesn't mean that you can't make more money when you need it. This doesn't mean you can't solve a relationship problem or get into a relationship. This doesn't mean you can't improve yourself. But this is something beyond all that. There's some transcendent to that that also includes all of that. It's a whole other paradigm of life. This doesn't mean that you can't solve a problem because reality is just perfect, but you recognize the very perfection and divine intelligence of existence itself, while also having the other side of the spectrum of, there can be a relative imperfection, like, for example, 2 + 2 = 5, right? We can say that's a mistake, right? But this perfection of reality that I spoke of is something beyond our sort of conventional perception of life. It's something more existential, the very existence, the very essence of life, the truth of what it actually is perfect, completely as it is, and is permeating absolutely everything. This is about shifting our relationship to all those things I mentioned, like structure, goals, the world, relationships, people, the human condition, right? This is about shifting our relationship to them to allow for more presence, conscious attention, connectedness, awareness, especially amidst the busyness of everyday life. So by integrating the essence of simply existing or non-doing, we become more attuned to the deeper flow of life, which can naturally enhance our effectiveness and fulfillment within the existing structures that we navigate. Again, if you guys are into Buddhism, you'll recognize that they talk about emptiness and form, right? The formlessness and the form. It's integrating both of these so that it's a cohesive whole rather than a potential escape from form, the pain of samsara, escaping that into nirvana, right? That's not how you reach nirvana. You reach nirvana by being at total peace with samsara. Samsara is nirvana, right? So the ordinary structures of our life, we learn how to bring more flow to them, more presence to them. Counterintuitively, sometimes this changes the structures of our lives because some of the structures can be so sick and our intuition is saying, hey, this needs to be changed. It's not in alignment. So we change it. Or sometimes that means some things stay the same, like waking up and brushing your teeth. That structure, pretty good. But the structure of overworking, of addictions, compulsions, desires that always come from wounding and unmet needs, this stuff begins to kind of be seen through and let go of. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comment section. Other than that, I'm currently doing one-to-one coaching. You can apply to work with me. Link is in the pinned comment. Take it easy.